now ready for our final presentation by Claire Mason.
Hi everyone. So today I'll be talking about my honors thesis topic, which is about opposition and repression, the significance of Putin's third term, and its implications for Russian politics and global relations. And the advisor for this thesis is Dr. Matthew. So I want to take you back to March 4th, 2012, when Russian citizens and countries around the world saw a teary-eyed Putin accept his election for a third term as president. And in his acceptance speech, he says, "We showed that our people know how to distinguish between the desire for change and renewal and political provocations that pursue the sole objective of undermining Russia's statehood and usurping powers." This quote and this image together signify a turning point for Russia going from an illiberal democracy to an authoritarian regime. Up until this point, Putin had already served 2 four-year terms as president. Afterwards, he served under Dmitry Medvedev as prime minister. While serving as prime minister, he was able to manipulate not only Medvedev, but also other Russian politicians to change the constitution of presidential term limits. Rather than serving 2 four-year terms, they can now serve 2 six-year terms. People who attempt to understand Russia and where it is now, they often look at documentaries or books or TV shows. And the narratives they provide often tell us about Putin chasing rats in his communist communal apartment, which taught him about power dynamics, or his time as a young KGB officer pushing paper behind a desk in Dresden, Germany. However, these narratives only explain why Putin is the way that he is, but it doesn't necessarily explain why Russia is the way that it is. People who have tried to understand why Russia has been on this path have used a political science lens, and this looks at the political structure of Russia. However, one flaw with this analysis is that it automatically dooms Russia to have become an authoritarian regime from the very beginning. As historians, we look at what happens. And right now, we're starting to see a trend in democratic countries starting to turn towards more strongman politics. Russia, specifically Putin's third term, gives us a lens into looking at how these changes happen and what mobilizes people against them, as well as what inspires this change. Putin's third term also illustrates that it's oftentimes not the people who want this change, but it's often the Russian politicians. To illustrate this, I want to talk a little bit about how this shows up in domestic politics and global relations. During Putin's first 2 terms as president, we see public opinion and Russian politics align with each other. However, leading up to his third election, we start seeing protests, most famously the Bolshoi Square protests, people coming out against this election. In addition, after winning his third term, we start seeing Putin taking oppressive measures against individual voices, journalists, as well as protests, which signify this change. In addition, in terms of global relations, in his first 2 terms, Russia sought out to have an amicable relationship with the West. However, we see a shift after his third term of Putin moving away from the West and looking further east and trying to ally himself with countries such as China. I just want to say that moments like these and historical events like these show us how moments can change the trajectory of a country as well as its future. And I want to share with you some probing questions that my research and this topic brings up and highlights the importance of this moment. And that is, what would Russia look like if Putin hadn't been able to win his third term as president? Would we have had the invasion of Crimea in 2014? Would we have had the total invasion of Ukraine in 2022? Or would Russia have been on a more democratic path towards a more democratic future? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Claire. And nice job with the distractions. I apologize for that.
I didn't even notice it.
Okay, good. Questions?
Yes.
This one's very simple. I don't speak Russian. Is the image on the slide like a rally in support of Putin or protest?
It's an opposition protest.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you.
Good job. I was wondering about what methodologies you're going to use to kind of make predictive claims about what could have happened.
What could have happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think historians are in the business of predicting the future, and that's not really what I'm trying to do with that. for those questions, I just really wanted to show you that this is a moment of significance that changes Russia's trajectory and highlights that it's really after Putin gets elected to his third term that we start seeing Russia taking more authoritarian leanings and tendencies. Yes?
I feel like you've kind of touched on this in the past, but I'm curious, writing on something that is so recent, how do you intend to like grapple with writing like the recent past?
Yes, that's definitely been a little bit of a struggle, but the way I'm thinking about it is that this is 2012, and I think we've already seen plenty of evidence, plenty of events that show us that there is that shift, that change in Russia's attitude and politics. So I'm not too worried about the recent events. I actually think it helps me be able to find sources and find voices that help demonstrate and support my argument for this.
I was wondering if you could speak a little more about like your access to sources and if you already have like an idea of what exactly will function as your primary sources, and if you anticipate there will be any challenges to finding like accurate representation, especially in like the significance of this third term, if there's like good like how you will, I guess, like balance what's in the news or like mainstream with what's actually happening if you don't always have a good idea of like the information and its accuracy.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I'd be traveling to Russia to look at archives and documents. So right now, what I'm going to be looking at is very conveniently, because it is 2012, a lot of magazines, a lot of journalists will publish things online, and it's very easy to translate those with translation tools and technology, but I also have access to people who do speak Russian that can help me translate that. So I also have access to political documents and a bunch of archival material from the Kremlin that I can translate to kind of look at more of the political changes. In terms of the social changes, I'm really going to be kind of looking at specific journalists that have reported on the protests and their perspectives on that. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. Okay.
Is the project going to focus on Putin specifically as an agent for democratic decline in Russia, or is it more about like the institutions of the Russian state that were vulnerable to a strong pen?
I think a little bit of both, because Putin does, under Medvedev, he's the key player in changing the constitution, in changing the presidential terms for president. So a little bit of both, but I would say more so I'm stressing it for Putin in that regard. Oh no.
I was wondering, and this has been a question for other people, but what was your motivation to choose this topic?
Yeah, I think this is kind of the accumulation of all the like Russian classes that I've taken, but because I've had such like a timeline of being able to see kind of what Russia's history, and more importantly, the most recent events, so Prigozhin marching on Moscow, the death of Navalny, and I've always been really interested in Russia's relationship with the West, specifically his conference with NATO. I've always seen that as like the turning point for when things went sour. But after the march on Moscow and the death of Navalny, I kind of started shifting my focus a little further up, and that's where I landed on 2012, because I'm very interested in how Russia kind of oppresses Russians and against voicing their opinions. And specifically what's really interesting to me as well is that in both with Prigozhin and with Navalny, we see a lot of people coming out in support of Prigozhin. They're throwing roses at him as he was going through towns. And then Navalny, people were going against Putin, saying, don't come out, don't warn him. They went against him. So obviously, I found there was a relationship between the Russian state and the Russian people.
My question is kind of related to Adelaide's, especially with like the global relations. Are you going to try to use primarily sources internal to Russia on global relations, or are you going to be looking at the like sources from countries that the relations or like having the relations with Russia, if that makes sense, or lack thereof?
I Definitely, right now my focus would be Russian centered, but I am interested in bringing in outside perspectives and how they view kind of the shift in relationship with Russia. I think that would add a very interesting and different dynamic to the analysis.
So obviously like writing recent history has like its pros and cons, and we've talked about that. But do you have like a specific temporal like stopping point that would cement like the historical nature of this project, like a year that you won't pass?
2012.
Okay.
2012, yeah.
Yeah.
The only time I would go past that would be in my afterword to talk about Prigozhin and kind of like the lasting effects of that. That's kind of.
Yeah, so I may want to talk a little bit more about like the interdisciplinary studies. So I think you also mentioned it's like it's somehow your research is relevant to political science and also like regional studies. So how can you please talk much more specifically about how you like differentiate your research from like other this kind of things like regional studies or studies on politics?
So like balancing like political science with historical like approaches
Yeah,
and
yeah.
other independent like journalism kind of in that sense.
So it's like, you mentioned that your research is quite, close to
Yes.
our time. So some people may perceive as a like a study on, Russia's politics, but not on its history. So how you like respond to these questions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's actually a question that I've been kind of like trying to grapple with, especially with trying to go through this presentation. And I think my focus is on the event itself, so it's third term, and looking at the subsequent events afterwards. So leading up to it, there's certain events that inspire Putin to realize I have to crack down on protests and independent voices and people who are going against me. And it's also identifying a divide between public opinion and Russian politics as well. And we see that right after his third term. So it's kind of having a pin in a moment in time, looking at what is before and what is after. And that's
Well, of course, this is something that you'll definitely develop with further research and study, but I'm wondering what you anticipate finding is so like unique about the third term in particular compared to say his first or his second that make this such a big, like important shift that you want to look at historically.
So I mentioned this a little, like really briefly in my presentation about public opinion and also global relations, but I can talk a little bit more about like the divide in public opinion. So in the first two terms, Russia didn't really make any political decisions that was outside of public opinion. So for example, with the second war in Chechnya, we see a lot of popular discourse around that as seeing the war as something that Russia needs to take care of, like the Islamic extremists and all that. While that is manipulated, Russia didn't act outside of that public opinion and discourse. However, after his third term and the protests leading up to it, we see a lot of Russian people saying, I don't want Putin to be president again. There's a very strong public opinion against him, but he still wins the election. And in addition, this is the first time we see a manipulation of elections as well. So Putin wins again. And after that, basically the attitude towards protests and dissidents and people speaking out against Putin is a lot different. While we do see Putin kind of cracking down on opposition his first two terms, it's not to the same extent and such extreme methods as after he wins his third term. So I don't know if that.
That answers, yeah.
Yeah. Chris.
So, do you have one? No, you can. Okay. So I think it's a fascinating topic, and I think historians will be asking this question 100 years from now, which is, what happens with Putin and with Russia once, they change the laws and he can now, become this strong man. And it's such a hard thing to try to answer. I mean, it's an impossible question to answer at this moment in time, right? Because because it's still a closed system, because a war is going on, because Putin hadn't died yet, and so there's so much and because he's so much in control of everything that goes on in the country. So it just strikes me that, I mean, and I think you should be honest about all of that up front. And, and not try to sugarcoat that, or those aren't problems to get around, those are just the realities of the situation. Back in the Cold War, they used to have what they called the Sovietologists. George Kennan was the most famous, right? People who would read the tea leaves within this closed system and try to make sense of it to the rest of the world. Nowadays, we have Putinologists, right? Who do the similar kinds of things, right? And so, I mean, one way to approach this subject is a study of the Putinologists, right? How do the Putinologists make sense of this shift? Because the shift is dramatic. I mean, you can remember back to George W. Bush, the way that Putin really tried to cultivate him. And Bush says, I've looked into his soul and he's a good man. And from that to where we are today, a huge shift. And so I just wonder if could you identify some of the Putinologists? I mean, who are the journalists right now? Who are the Russian observers in the West who come up in your sources most often? Who kind of are giving the regular reading public a sense of what's going on behind the curtain? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So like basically what's like the popular academic like telling of.
Or yeah, who has insight? Who has the sources? Who has the connect? Is it Thomas Friedman? Or is it, probably not, but I mean, I don't know,
Yeah, well, the one person that really comes to mind, he actually wrote a really recent book about Putin and the whole chronologically Philip Short. He's kind of seen as the person, he was a journalist, and so he's really approached Putin and kind of trying to attempt to give us a, I don't know, like objective approach to kind of saying, well, this is like from the very beginning, like his parents, and then all the way to the Ukraine war. But I will say, in terms other people, so for example, the two books that I read from my book review, Fry and Satter, like those are two other really big voices in understanding Putin, like political science and journalists. They're very like different approaches to that.
right?
But something that really stood out to me was they all kind of started in the same area, and that was Putin's time as a KGB officer. They all start there. And when I was reading them in terms of my research for his third term, they only spend like 3 pages on it. They don't really dedicate a lot of time on it,
Yeah.
despite them saying there's all these protests, the Blood 9 Square protests. They kind of just glance over it. And they really kind of look towards like Yeltsin and the Chechen wars as an explanation for how Russia got from point A to point B invading Ukraine. So I'm kind of challenging that explanation and saying, no, it didn't really start with Chechnya, it didn't really start with him being a KGB officer. It really starts in his third term when he's able to manipulate it. And I will add that another reason why he was so interested in getting his third term is because of what happened with NATO. His fallout with NATO. And when he saw Medvedev kind of being very like Western leaning, wanting to have a positive relationship with the West, he didn't like that because he saw the West as not following up on what they say. He's like, no, the West doesn't do what they say. They don't practice what they preach, and I don't like that, and that is not good for Russia. So I'm gonna take over. I'm gonna make sure I get power back. So Russia does. Because I know what's good for Russia, and the West isn't. So that's kind of the dynamics of it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a really great project, and I think with Professor Crispino, you're raising very profound and very difficult, questions. And I'm wondering, it reminds me a little, I'm interested in the global piece. And I'm reminded of the work of Steve Cohen, the late Steve Cohen, because as I remember, one of the things he was arguing was it was precisely the bad decisions of the West that helped explain the rise of this increasingly authoritarian order. So it seems like you're sympathetic to that argument, or not?
I mean, I don't know if sympathetic's the right word. I'd say I agree with that argument,
Mhm.
and because I've realized that myself. But I wouldn't necessarily say that is the reason for authoritarian leanings in the country. I say that's more him saying, I don't want to have a relationship with the West anymore, so I'm gonna go east, I'm gonna go with China, I'm gonna make a relationship with Turkey more so.
Mm.
And that's kind of how I see it. And it's also him realizing the West is he uses a lot, he claims like the West is very anti-Russia. And so he uses that to justify, I guess, his authoritarian trajectory. But
It's very similar to the debate people had during the Cold War, which is, to what degree, were the Soviets aggressive after World War II because they were protecting their western border across which they had been flanked, and to what degree was it kind of an ideologically driven, aggressive, drive for Soviet revolution, for communist revolution around the globe. And I think there's a similar debate here as to, is Putin who he is now because he's the former KGB officer who was always going to be looking to reimpose the authoritarianism of the Soviet order in a different form? Or did the West screw up and alienate Russia and turn them more confrontational than they otherwise need to have been because of bungling and because of not being able to evolve and things? And so to the degree to which you can keep those arguments foregrounded in your analysis, and you don't even have to take a side necessarily, but to present the ongoing debate, I think will make this really, really rich.
And it also raises something I think Lynn Hunt, that we've discussed, is how you think about contingency and conjuncture. Because these are both conceptual issues that seem very much at play.
Great. Other questions? All right, thanks so much.